Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer from PCDN. Delighted to be here for our new episode of the Social Change Career Podcast. This is Season 10, Episode 12. Happy Episode 12. Delighted to be here today with Darius Graham, who is based in Baltimore, Maryland. I am based in Medellin, Colombia. We're going to be talking about philanthropy, social impact, careers, board service, and many other things. For people who have not joined the podcast live stream before, generally this goes about 50 minutes to an hour. We love to hear where people are watching from. So throughout the podcast, please feel free to put in the LinkedIn chat a message about your background and where you're watching from. And we also really like to bring in questions and comments. So feel free to put your questions, comments, and we'll try to bring them as much as possible into the conversation. This is recorded, so it'll be live on LinkedIn and YouTube immediately after this. And then this will be converted to one of our 100+ episodes of the podcast, which will go live in about a month. And the one thing I would ask people to consider, if you like the podcast, share it, rate it, like it, and check out the 100 other episodes. And you can find us on PCDN.global or any of the major podcasting platforms, Spotify, Apple, Google Podcast, Podcast Addict, or whatever else. Our next podcast coming up is and I'll plug this again at the end, is on May 12th with Catalina Duque, who is an Ashoka Fellow and is the president of the Mi Sangre Foundation, and has been working in social impact innovation startups for over 25 years. And if anybody knows Juanes, the musician, it's his foundation. So, check out his music. I live in Colombia. He's one of the most interesting musicians in the world. So again, I'll plug that at the end. And so let me just summarize Darius's bio. He is the program director of the Baltimore at the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, which is a leading foundation that's been around for 30 years, doing grant making in all sorts of interesting areas. And he's a lawyer and a leader in the areas of philanthropy, social impact, and innovation. Across his different roles, he's helped innovate institutions and engaged directly with lots of communities and helps organizations achieve transformational change. The Weinberg Foundation is one of the largest private charitable foundations in the US, and he helps guide the distribution of over $30 million in grants annually to nonprofits working in housing, health, workforce development, and education in Baltimore and beyond. He's a civil society fellow with the Aspen Institute, which if you don't know them, I'd encourage you to check them out, the Anti-Defamation League, and a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. At the Baltimore Museum of Art, he serves as a trustee. It's one of the most interesting art museums in the East Coast, if not in the US. Chair of the Public Engagement Committee and co-chair of the Search Committee. Darius previously served as board co-chair of Community Law and Action, where he led an executive search, a merger, and increase in net assets. He also previously worked at Johns Hopkins, where he was the founding executive director of 2 university-wide innovation entrepreneurship programs, the Social Innovation Lab and Fast Forward U, where he helps students, faculty, and local residents transform novel ideas and new technologies into viable ventures. And just to mention, on our podcast about a month ago, we had Madison Marks, who works at UNICEF Ventures, who also has worked at the Social Innovation Lab at Johns Hopkins as the director. So just going to welcome a few people. Welcome Kimberly from Maine, welcome Ernest from Rwanda, welcome Eric from Baltimore, wonderful. Again, as we go throughout this, please put in the comments where you're watching from. Welcome Leanne from Toronto. And also, if you're open, just share a sentence or two about your background or work interests, and feel free to start putting in your comments and questions as we go throughout the session. So Darius, thank you so much for making time this morning to join us from Baltimore, and great to have you here. And so can you talk a little bit about throughout your career, whether in higher education and grant making and philanthropy and board service, what ties the focus of the impact you're seeking to have?
Yeah, great question. And thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today and to talk about careers and social impact and all of this important things that I really enjoy. So in terms of threads throughout the career, I think looking back on all the different things that I've done, it's really been about sort of aligning resources to needs. When I was a first-year associate at a law firm in the corporate bankruptcy group, you probably can imagine, just based on my career since then, that was not the best fit for me. And I recognized pretty early on that there was just a gulf in terms of opportunities in Northwest DC and the experience that I was having at a law firm and in other neighborhoods in DC. And it was around the time of the Great Recession. So you would see articles that were saying DC was immune from the recession because of government contractors. But you had neighborhoods that had unemployment rates double the national average. So in that moment, I was thinking, we have all these resources and opportunities in one part of town. How do we bring those to bear in another part of town and invest in people in those communities and uplift their ideas and help them transform their own communities? And so that has been a common thread about sort of matching resources with needs, investing in and uplifting grassroots leaders. So with DC Social Innovation Project, that's just what we did. And with Social Innovation Lab at Hopkins, it continued that mission of investing in people who had great ideas and knew their neighborhoods, knew their issues, but needed support from institutions. And then even now with the Weinberg Foundation, I get the opportunity to, again, sort of invest in leaders and organizations that are working to make a real difference in their communities.
And thank you so much. I'm going to welcome a few other people. Welcome Tabrini from Aceh, Indonesia. Welcome, I can get your name, but someone saying you're an incredible leader. Welcome Barnaba from Kenya and Leanne from Canada. So please keep letting us know where you're watching from and your comments. So Darius, if you think back to when you were a teenager, I mean, did you aspire to go into the legal profession and that's why you chose to do law school? And then how soon into that career did you realize and you wanted to shift to something more community engagement and, you know, moving assets to communities or with communities? And how did you make that change?
Yeah, I think, you know, looking back on it, I really wanted to, I went to college, I went to Florida A&M originally with the goal of doing broadcast journalism. I don't know if you can picture me like here at like a TV studio or like reporting live from Baltimore, but my original goal was to do broadcast journalism. And Florida A&M has just a tremendous pathway to law program. And when I was there, I had always had an interest in government and really, you know, public interest issues. And because of that pathway to law program and the mock trial team that I got involved with, I saw law as like a real pathway to make change in communities. So it was because of that program that I got interested and really saw a pathway to go to law school. And then when I chose, when Berkeley chose me and then I chose Berkeley as a place that I would go, I went again with the idea that I wanted to go somewhere where social justice, public interest law was not just something nice to do, but could really be a focus for my experience. So that's what led me there. And then just through the circumstances of being in law school, and there's a heavy on-campus recruiting program for law firms, I said I would try out the corporate law firm route, especially because it got me back to the East Coast for a couple summers. So that was how I got into that law pathway.
And then can you, when in terms of moving to Johns Hopkins, you know, did you do a blind application? Someone recommended you? And, you know, how did you start moving to kind of that community engagement role? And how long did you stay in corporate law? Like I have a good friend who works in gender and international development. So she did banking law for 4 or 5 years, you know, and made good money, but she knew that, like, she got the experience, but knew that was not her. So
yeah.
Like how long did you stay at that kind of role before you knew you had to get out, and how long did it take to make that change?
Yeah, so I did 2 summers during law school at 2 different law firms. And then once I graduated and passed the bar exam, I spent a year at the law firm in the corporate bankruptcy group. And I knew pretty early on that it wasn't going to be sort of the right fit for me professionally, again, because more of the like public interest work was some of the pro bono assignments that we did on the side. And I didn't want impact in that way to be like on the side for me. I wanted to be really my focus. So I left the law firm to start DC Social Innovation Project, led and grew that organization for several years. And, you know, we were always pretty much a small sort of community-driven grassroots organization and had a tremendous impact with the organizations that we supported. And there came a time several years into being the leader of that organization that I thought it was time to sort of try something different. I wanted to do similar work, but on a different scale, with more resources and being able to impact, a larger community. I also thought that as the founder of DC Social Innovation Project, I didn't want to be in that role forever and wanted to give the opportunity for someone else to come in as executive director and put their stamp on the organization. So just in looking at opportunities for what I would do next, I remember sort of by chance or fate coming across the posting to be the first director of the Social Innovation Lab. And it was an interesting time for SIL because SIL was actually started as a graduate student club. So there were students at Hopkins who wanted to come together around topics of social innovation and entrepreneurship, have a place where they could work on their ventures together, get support from the university. And ultimately, they did such a great job at this that the university president at the time said, we will fund this, we will hire staff, and we'll make this more of a university-wide program. So after many, many interviews, I was selected as the first director of Social Innovation Lab.
So several times in your career already, you've been, let's say, the founder or helping to build something new, whether it's your own organization or within a larger institution. Can you talk a little bit about what are the core skills you have used in those two roles and beyond? And did you develop them in law school, through peer learning, through your undergraduate degree, and for people who want to work at this intersection of impact and innovation, regardless if it's a nonprofit or a foundation or university, what are the skills that you think are most essential?
Yeah, I will say, despite not practicing law at this point in time, the training and the experience and the education is really a large part of what I rely on in all of these roles, except for the first job that I had where I was an associate at a law firm. Every job I've had since then, I've been the first person in that role. And it really requires just a real comfort with ambiguity, taking an entrepreneurial approach, or some people call it intrapreneurship, being an entrepreneur within an institution. And I think for me, the way that the legal training comes into play is that I get really comfortable with sort of figuring out what are the key issues, the big questions, the challenges, and then thinking of those as a framework and then coloring in those lines and figure out what the path forward is. So I think, if you're someone that has, again, comfort with ambiguity, you don't really need a training manual or sort of a operating procedures for your position, but you can really sort of come in, assess the situation, and sort of define that. Then I would encourage you to look for these kinds of roles that really are creative. I'll also say, Craig, that, when I started DC Social Innovation Project, that was really my first experience as an entrepreneur. And one of the things that I realize that I enjoy is, I know that, in society, we focus a lot on entrepreneurs, especially startup founders, but I also encourage people to think about entrepreneurship from that internal perspective as well, about how you can work within systems, within institutions, and help them do things creatively and differently than they ever have before. So at this point, just having done it now, several times, I'm just really into going into an organization who wants to be creative and innovative and help them identify ways to do that.
And let's say, others, when they reach out to you for mentoring or just your advice, and someone wants to work at an organization, again, they may not know the for-profit, nonprofit, foundation, educational institution, but they want to work in the impact space. So for people, let's say in undergrad or a few years out of grad school, what do you recommend are the skills that you find most valuable across your roles? And do people need a graduate degree? Do they just need life experience? And how do you think about upskilling? And what you've talked about, law school is very valuable, and learning to see the full picture and work with ambiguity, to build teams. But what are the areas you see when someone contacts you and say, I really want to work for social impact? And again, that can mean a million different things. What skills do you encourage people to make sure they consider developing?
Yeah, I'm going to go I'm going to say that these are sort of basic, but I think they're very important. And I think there are many ways that you can sort of build on these skills, and I'll get to that. But I think One of them is around listening, and the other is around writing. The other is around synthesizing and analyzing information. I think with the listening piece, especially in social impact, like we are doing this work for other people. It's fulfilling for me and for those, the people I work with, my colleagues, but truly we're doing this work for other people. So we really have to be guided by the folks that we're serving, the partners that we're working with out in the field. So I think the sort of the ability to listen and to distill information and to engage with the variety of stakeholders and sort of take all that you may hear, read, see, and learn and distill that into a plan of action is really a key skill. The other is around writing. A lot of the work that I have done over the course of my career has been sort of written. So whether that's proposals to get funding for DC Social Innovation Project, whether that's writing impact reports or annual reports for Social Innovation Lab that's going to deans or funders or the university president, or even now I do a ton of writing in my job at the foundation because whenever I recommend a grant, I have to write sort of a case for that for our president and CEO and for our trustees to approve. So the ability to really write well and again, to synthesize information and make a strong case for what you're trying to achieve is really important. I think there's a really strong balance between getting sort of a degree, a graduate degree, or a certificate, getting skills that way or signifiers of the skill. I think that's certainly important to do. So again, whether that's a graduate degree, whether it's a certificate, maybe it's an online course that you get some kind of digital certification for, I highly encourage that because I think those will really give you opportunities to learn from the instructors and the people who have done the work. It'll help you meet other people in that graduate program or in that course. So you're building your network, which can be helpful going forward. So I would say definitely consider the sort of credential aspect of it, but I would not focus on that only. I would say also look to opportunities, whether it's in your current organization or whether it's through volunteering, where you can actually practice some of these skills. So for example, maybe there's an institution or organization that a friend of yours runs or that's in your community and you want to volunteer with them on a specific project. Maybe it's helping them write a grant proposal, or maybe it's helping them revamp their website. Maybe it's helping them interview different stakeholders for their strategic planning process. So you can get some of this from like school or from courses. I would encourage that, but I would also think about finding ways that you can also apply it through like volunteering or through fellowships or part-time opportunities as well.
Wonderful. So again, welcome Barnaby from the Kakuma camp in Kenya. So for some reason, Madison's name's not showing up, but this is coming from Madison Marks. So Darius, you are heavily invested in Baltimore from a philanthropic perspective, lots of different roles. And she's curious, how would you say the international entrepreneurs can learn from the Baltimore ecosystem or connect? What lessons from your own work might you share with international social entrepreneurs, or how can they connect with the Baltimore ecosystem?
Yeah, I think there are many ways to connect. I mean, there's a number of organizations and we can share links or folks can find me later and I'm happy to refer them. There's lots of great ecosystem partners here in Baltimore, like Social Innovation Lab. There's an organization called Baltimore Core that supports social entrepreneurs and has fellowship opportunities for people to start their careers or sort of grow in the social impact space. There's Venture for America. I saw Eric was on earlier, which has great opportunities in Baltimore and beyond as well. There's a group called Upsurge, which supports the tech and startup ecosystem. There's Innovation Works that supports especially underrepresented entrepreneurs. So one of the great things about Baltimore that I would say can be a model for other places is that we really have a strong ecosystem, which we always strive to have even stronger, but there's so many different opportunities. So when you are starting something here, you can be a part of Social Innovation Lab, and then you could be a part of Innovation Works program, and then you can be a part of the Upsurge Techstars Accelerator. So there really is a pathway where you can sort of have your idea, get started, and grow over time with support from different institutions. So I think that's something that really could be learned as a model for other places. The other thing that I would mention, though, is that one of the things that I always try to keep my eye on in Baltimore is this connection between people that are new to Baltimore or who are not originally from here, such as myself. I've been here for almost 10 years now, but I think it can be very different if you are not from here, originally didn't grow up here or haven't been here for 20 plus years, or if you are originally from here. So I'm always conscious of how are we making connections between sort of newcomers or folks like myself who maybe have been here for 10 years, but not 20 or 30, and then folks who are from here. Because I think that connection is really important. When I was leading the Social Innovation Lab, it was originally for students at Hopkins. And, I, after consulting with some of our advisors and others, made the decision early on that we were going to remove that requirement and make the resources at SIL available to anyone in the community. Because, I knew and we knew that, there's so much knowledge and great ideas that people who live in neighborhoods in Baltimore have, but they may not often have access to resources like SIL. So I would say for those international entrepreneurs, think about sort of how you're connecting communities, people who are, new to a place, but from there, can they be part of a team together? How can you create spaces where they're learning from each other and sharing ideas? I think that's critically important.
Thank you so much. So again, lots of questions are coming in and comments. So this one, we'll see, it's from Tabrani, who works in Aceh. And I think there's a typo in here, but basically he works on entrepreneurship with women, innovators in Aceh and Indonesia. And just saying one of the biggest challenges that he's facing is a lack of access or lack of financial resources. So I'm curious, from your work at the Social Innovation Lab, in your previous work, what are some tips, and particularly as a funder, or at least representing a funder, what are your tips for how, what makes for a compelling proposal when you've asked for money or when you're helping to allocate money, what makes something more compelling than others? And actually, just a separate question, maybe start with this. Can you demystify a little bit the grant making process? Not that you have to get into all the inner workings, but, for example, how much is put out, call for proposals? How are those interests defined? How much is unsolicited funding? And, and obviously not give away anything confidential, but just like for someone who doesn't understand the grant making process, like what are some steps you would encourage people just to understand how funders look at solicited or unsolicited proposals?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing that I would say is that when it comes to foundations in particular, is that they're all different. They will have their own funding priorities, their own process. Some will accept unsolicited proposals. Some will want a conversation first. Some may have planned out their grants for several years to come, so they may not even have an application process. So I think the first thing that I would say is when you identify a funder or an opportunity, just understand what the best process is for getting in there. So for something like a Social Innovation Lab or Innovation Works or so on, those are opportunities where they're like open application processes where, every couple, on a certain schedule, there will be a call for applications. You can apply. You don't need to have a special conversation. You don't need to reach out. You don't need to know someone there to get in the door. So understand if that's sort of the way to go. On the other hand, with many private funders, private foundations, they may have more complex procedures. So it may be the case that you need to have a conversation with someone on staff first. It may be that you can just submit your information online. It may be that you have to find someone who can introduce you to the person because they only take sort of warm introductions. So I would say really just take some time to understand, what the preferred process is. And I think most places will have this somewhere on their website. I also think that many, places are just open to questions. So if you can't find that information out online, feel free to make a phone call or email someone or send them a message on LinkedIn and say, hey, had a question about what's the preferred way to have a conversation or to get a proposal in. I think they're also different. So there's just no standard process. In terms of the question that came up and sort of what makes a compelling request or proposal, The first thing that came to mind was really around storytelling, and not just in a I don't mean that in terms of like having a beautiful website with graphics and beautiful pictures, but I mean really thinking about sort of the people that you're serving or the entrepreneurs that you're working with from that example, and like what are the stories of some of those entrepreneurs and how they have launched businesses or grown their endeavors, not only because of you but in part because of the work that you're offering, or the work that you're doing in partnership with them. So I would think about some of the stories of those individual people because I think the storytelling component is compelling. I would also pair that though with some data and metrics, and I don't mean like you don't need an algorithm for this or like a randomized control trial. This is really like saying, okay, if you've supported 10 entrepreneurs in your program, over the past however many years, like have some percentages. How many of those folks graduated from the program? How many have still are still working on their businesses? How much funding have they received, and so on. So, if I'm talking about the Social Innovation Lab, or if Madison was talking about the Social Innovation Lab, we would probably do two things to tell you about it. One would be I would tell you the story of someone like Brittany Young, who was a teacher and she's from West Baltimore, and she really wanted to help young people who were interested in dirt bikes, get on the track to become engineers and have careers in the STEM field. So she created B360. And so I would go on and tell you the story about her and how she started in SIL, then was a part of Baltimore Core, then was an OSI fellow. Now she's a TED fellow, Echoing Green fellow, Ashoka fellow. She's phenomenal. But then I would also say over the past, 10 plus years, Social Innovation Lab has supported over 100 ventures that have raised, tens of millions of dollars, created 302 jobs. So I would say balance between the storytelling of like individuals and what they've achieved, and then also have some numbers to back it up as well. And don't worry about the numbers being too small or not being really scientific. Just think about sort of what you've achieved and how you can quantify that.
So that's great advice, and also something we frequently say at PCN and lots of others in the social impact employment sector is if you're doing a cover letter, resume, applying for a job, you need compelling data, but also a story. And often aggregating the data across your roles can be more compelling than just sharing one thing. And to talk a little bit about hiring in your different roles, whether currently or across the places you've worked, can you talk a little bit about your tips when you've hired for talent? What do you look for in candidates? How much is personal connections? How much is convincing cover letter? How much is just like the wow factor that this person, how much, and just like your general tips when someone's applying for a job, regardless of the sector, is it the same things you're talking about in terms of a compelling proposal for, a funder, or is it something different?
Good question. From my perspective on the hiring piece, so I've done it in a number of different ways. So one has been when I was at Hopkins and we would hire, we had fellowship positions where we would get part-time social design fellows or other folks that would support our entrepreneurs. I also hired different team members that were called student venture coordinators or other people on the team who would support, the operations of Social Innovation Lab and really help connect some of our entrepreneurs with resources. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I've been now a lead on 2 executive searches. So I've also, helped recruit and hire an executive director for a nonprofit that has a budget of around $200,000 to $300,000. And I also led the search process to find the leader of a $23 million nonprofit organization. So I think in all of those cases, I think if I had to pick one thing, I think it's really, of course, you want someone who sort of checks the boxes of the qualifications and has sort of the technical skills and experience that you need. But I also think for me, what a differentiator is and can be is someone who can really deal with issues that neither of you have predicted yet. I think, everyone knows, like when you have a job, there is a job description, but probably what you're doing at this point is, maybe 50% of that is a job description, and like it's grown over time and you're doing all these other things. So I think it's more about like, do you have the ability, the temperament, the sort of creativity, the problem solving skills, and really like the social and emotional intelligence skills to be able to deal with whatever may come in this role. And so I think that's really important as well. And I think in terms of when you ask about sort of the process and like cover letters and things, I mean, I think that those certainly help. You know, you want to put your best foot forward in your cover letter or your application. Certainly talk about all the different types of things that you've done. But again, don't just say like, I did this, I was in this job, I reviewed proposals, I made grant recommendations. Really talk about what were the problems that you solved or the big questions that you helped answer. What were the things that you helped change within that organization? I'd say think about how you went beyond what were the sort of, basic duties in the job description and how you really sort of made an impact in that organization, and give specific examples.
Thank you so much. So we'll get to landing or working on board roles, but a question came in from Eric, which I think is specific to his work in East Africa, but I want to see if you have any insights. So he's working on circular economy in East Africa, and obviously the foundation's funding US. But do you have any insights from your work about if someone's working around circular economy or regenerative economy, any trends, any networks people might look at, or just when from your work at Baltimore, some of the people that you engage with? And I love the story of B360. Madison shared that as well. It's not circular economy, but and any tips where to look for community funding networks around, let's say, sustainability and green economy?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and it's I would say slowly. Unfortunately, I wish there were more, but it's slowly becoming more of a topic that I'm seeing and hearing more about. I think part of what I have seen that's been interesting, and I think we might see more of, is sort of connections between sustainability and sort of other social justice issues. So one example here in Baltimore is that there is an incinerator in South Baltimore, and so I think there are arguments that can be made about sort of the environmental impact of that, and those arguments have been made. And I think what's also compelling is when people talk about how sort of the environmental impact also relates to social justice and racial equity and sort of historic devaluing of Black neighborhoods in Baltimore and the connections there. So I think, think about not just the work that you're doing in one vertical, but think about sort of the connections and impacts to other areas as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's wonderful. Anyone based in the US, the EPA has actually been hiring for a bunch of new positions focused on sustainability and equity around race and environmental justice, because as Darius said, there's so much environmental racism, and just doing sustainability without thinking about larger systematic racial and economic justice issues is challenging. So I want to get to board stuff. So actually we have a lot of people ask me this, but so let's say, how in the world did you land your first board role? And what are your recommendations? First, can you describe what it means to be on a board, and then how did you land it? And then we can go to the next questions after that.
Yeah, this is a topic I'm really excited to talk about. So nonprofit boards. So nonprofits, at least in the US, there may be different requirements depending on other countries, but US nonprofits that are organized as 501c3 tax-exempt charities, there are requirements that maybe vary by state in terms of the number of board members and the rules that are required. But generally, I think everyone knows that with the nonprofit, there's like an executive director, a CEO. That person is really the staff lead and leads the day-to-day efforts of the organization. The board of directors, sometimes called board of trustees, is really sort of a governance structure. The executive director or CEO reports to that board, and the board really focuses not on the day-to-day work, but really on the overall strategy and the governance. They are really sort of like supervisor, but not sort of loosely, but importantly, of the executive director or CEO. So it's a really important role. They're really the ultimate responsibility. They have the ultimate responsibility for the organization. So I've I first got involved in boards, I believe, when I was in law school, and there was a youth court nonprofit that was looking for board members, and I was connected there. But what I recommend in terms of finding them is just really letting people know that you're interested. Um, you can also sort of look for organizations in your community that may work on an issue that's important to you, or work with the population that you're a part of or that you care about, and it's something where you can reach out to them and ask about it. You typically won't see sort of job postings to be on a nonprofit board. Usually it happens through like networks or word of mouth. On the boards that I've been on, when we're recruiting for board members, there's usually like a board meeting and people will say, we have 2 open spots. Who do you know? People will nominate folks that they either work with or are in their network. So it's really heavily focused on sort of these networks. So I think, if you're interested in nonprofit board service, which I hope people are, because I think it's a great way to build relationships in your community and to also gain skills and get experience that you may not otherwise be able to get in your day job. Let people know that you're interested. Let them know what kinds of organizations you'd like to be on the board of, and what particular skills you would bring. Most board searches, they are looking for people with some kind of skill to bring to the board, whether that's you can help with fundraising, or you can help with the financials. Maybe you can help with marketing. Maybe you can help them plan events. Maybe you have some issue expertise that you can bring to the board. But I think it's just about finding an organization that you're interested in being a part of, and letting that be known. The other thing I'll mention is that there's often programs that are sort of board training programs for nonprofit boards. So like in Baltimore, for example, there's a group called Associated Black Charities that has a board pipeline program where you can actually apply to go through a training, and then at the end, you'll likely be matched with the nonprofit board that you can be a part of. There's also a group here called Business Volunteers Maryland that has a similar program. So I'd say if you're in sort of a big city that has an active nonprofit ecosystem, look for organizations like that. Maybe it's United Way where you are, or maybe it's an association of nonprofits, but find those groups, because there may be sort of a training program that you could be a part of. But really, I think it's about just letting people in your network know that you're looking. The way I got onto the Baltimore Museum of Art board was because I was sort of new in my role at the foundation. We have a really strict conflict of interest policy, so I could only be on very specific kinds of boards, like an art museum. And so I was just having conversations with a friend, catching up and telling her that I wanted to get more involved in the community, but I could really only be on the boards of an art museum or a university. And she happened to say, oh, you should meet my friend who's on the board of the BMA. And that was really the beginning of it. So really let people know what you're interested in, because they can be really helpful.
Thank you so much. So I have a million questions on boards. I mean, I've been on a bunch of boards and advisory boards, but first, one thing, and also some other organizations like Bridgespan has some good stuff for board training. Echoing Green does a lot on equity and inclusion, and there's a lot out there. So as Darius said, instead of just going out into the wild, often first find the network organizations or the network hubs or the funders that might be supporting training, or looking for people, and then you can go for individual organizations. So one question for people who might be new to potential board service, not all organizations are healthy. I mean, all organizations have challenges, financial challenges and stuff, but I've had some conversations recently with friends and former alum where there's been like unethical behavior. I won't go into any details. So how do you encourage, if someone's looking for a board service? I mean, it's almost like, it's not a marriage, because board service generally is 1 or 2 terms, let's say between 2 to 6 years, depending how many terms, it could be a little longer. But how do you vet, like the board wants to vet you as a potential candidate, but how do you encourage, if you're a potential board member, what should you look for to try to decide, one, if it matches your interest and skills, but 2, like that you're not getting into a situation mean, sometimes it's not unethical, just the money's running out.
Sure.
You know,
Yeah.
I've been on boards where we're halfway through, and the CEO is transparent; it's not their fault. But we're halfway through the year, and they don't know where the next payroll is going to come from, which happens to a lot of nonprofits. But sometimes it's more serious. How do you vet an organization?
Yeah, good question. One, I should also mention that like being on a board of directors or board of trustees, there are like legal implications of that. So yes, do your vetting. I would ask for, if they don't send you this, for bigger organizations, they may have like a board packet, like a board recruitment or onboarding packet where they'll send you like their past audits and tax return, like tax, submissions, their financial statements. But certainly you can ask for those, like ask for, can I, see a copy of the most recent financials or the audits? You can ask for copies of board minutes so you can see like what has been discussed in the board meetings. You can also just ask, are there any issues that may not be reflected here that we should know about? But definitely review things like audits, financials, board minutes. And I would say just, don't speak just to like the board chair or the executive director, like talk to other people in the organization or on the board to get their understanding of what the challenges may be. And I also think it's fair to like ask, like, what are you really proud of that this organization has done and is doing? What are you most excited about? And then what are the big challenges? Ask like what keeps you up at night, or what is sort of the next big challenge for this organization? And they may say it's fundraising. We need to identify where our next annual budget's going to come from. But definitely ask those questions.
And just one other thing I often share is if I've been on a board, I make it very clear like what I am comfortable with and what I'm not. So I mean, I'm not a fundraiser, and so when I've been on boards where people are like, here's my $50,000, $80,000 check, and I'm like, well, here's my $200 check. So I think often like just being clear like what you think you can bring and just having that discussion. Because a lot of organizations struggle with fund, and I can help in fundraising in other ways, but just a lot of organizations, that's one of their biggest challenges. And often there's this image, we just need to get people on the board to raise more money. And so I think if you're a potential board member, just be clear, like not saying set firm boundaries, but just like what is it that you think you can add and what maybe are not your strengths.
Yeah, and one of the questions too to ask when you're considering joining a board is like, what is the financial expectation? Like for some boards, they will have like a specific dollar amount that you as a board member have to give every year. That could be $50, that could be hundreds of dollars, it can be thousands of dollars. There may be an opportunity where you don't have to give it personally, but you can maybe raise that amount, like from your friends. Maybe the raising doesn't have to be you finding, a wealthy individual to get them to give, but maybe it's like having a fundraiser that you host at your home or in the park or with your friends to raise money for the organization as well. But definitely ask what the financial expectation is as a board member. It makes sure you're comfortable.
So the next question is a little bit, you talked about this some, but just in terms of both philanthropy and your career, in terms of equity and justice, what are some of the really interesting, because there's a lot of research that, in terms of CEOs of nonprofits, they're still not representative of the US population, and boards even less so. And so just kind of what do you think are some of the interesting developments and challenges around not just racial equity, but just justice, particularly in philanthropy, in terms of who gets to decide who's funding who, and how it's changing. Like, for example, if people don't know the work of Edgar Villanueva, Decolonizing Wealth is just a brilliant, incredible organization, movement, book, where he comes from the philanthropy community, he's Native American, and really just kind of challenges a lot of the assumptions around who gets power in philanthropy. So just any reflections on that, not in your current role, but just in general in philanthropy in terms of power, decision-making, and equity.
Yeah, that's a big topic, which I'm happy to chime in on. And I think you frame it beautifully, because often what I think happens traditionally is that institutions will talk about sort of the work that they're doing to support, communities of color or women or historically marginalized groups. And yet the challenge is that those decisions are still being made by people who have historically, had, decision-making authority, and that's not shared with the people who are sort of on the receiving end. the beautiful way that I've heard it described is in terms of like plumbing, like water and plumbing in your home. Like, think of the dollars and the financial resources as the water that flows through the pipes. So like it gets where it needs to go. But what we really should be thinking about as a nonprofit sector is like, how do we change the plumbing, like the actual pipes, which is the decision-making process. Whereas like who's in the boardroom, how those networks and connections are made, what is even the decision-making criteria? Are we looking at past performance? Are we looking at like 10 years of data, which is gonna, prioritize, more long-standing traditional organizations versus newer, perhaps more innovative organizations? So yes, it's really thinking about like, how do we change the decision-making process and not just make decisions on behalf of groups or for groups. You could potentially say with, groups that are on the receiving end, but I think it's even the next step is how do we, support people who are part of the client base and sort of bring them into leadership opportunities. So if you are a nonprofit organization or a funder, like, do you have a board or a committee that's made up of people that you're serving? Like, is there a place where they can directly give you feedback? And I would say maybe go one step beyond feedback, and can they have some authority to actually make some changes or allocate where some things happen? So I think, Craig, you're right. It's really about the power and not just sort of doing things to help people. We need to get beyond that and really give the people opportunities to take up leadership and have some power over how decisions are made about their communities.
Thank you. And I put it again, look up decolonizing wealth. There's lots of people working on this. And I think even in the next few days, I think registration closed, but Edgar and his team are hosting like a decolonizing philanthropy event online that's open to philanthropic staff, I think, in the US and perhaps around the world. So look up decolonizing wealth. So one question, and I'm just thinking, like, I've worked at lots of different organizations, and one organization I worked for, we had funding from the US government, and I was like the program officer, in charge of the budget and keeping everyone happy and the donor happy. And, I used to think about this, like, we got the money from US government, they got the money from the taxpayers, we have our partners. Mm-hmm. We didn't have budget transparency. I was just thinking about, I used to think about this, and like our partners were like, they were partners, but they weren't real partners because they were implementing almost like for us. And so I'm just curious, not necessarily specific to your work, but what do you find, is it trust-based philanthropy, or in terms of the philanthropic sector, what do you see as some of the most exciting trends or developments or initiatives? And how does that connect to potential career paths for people who want to work in philanthropy?
Yeah, that's a great question. There, you mentioned trust-based philanthropy, and it's taken me back to my previous response, which is there's really a growing movement. I've seen more examples of either trust-based philanthropy or what some people call participatory grant making, where again, it's not just people, sitting in a boardroom or in an office making decisions about what's happening, but it's actually engaging the people who are part of the population that's being served and getting them in the room, or maybe you going to them and helping and having them make some decisions as well. So I think that's great. There's an example of it here in Baltimore. There's an initiative called Be More Invested, where institutions came together, and then funders, including Weinberg Foundation, contributed to have a board that was comprised of 1/3 of funders, so 1/3 of people like me who were representing the financial institutions that were funding this, and then 2/3 were made up of community residents who were not part of that sort of power structure or typical decision-making authority. And so it gave more power and authority to the folks who are like in the community sort of doing the work, instead of the folks like me who sort of typically get to make the decisions. And so I think that was just a really great model. And we funded 10 different nonprofits through that in Baltimore, who are just doing tremendous work around community wellness and public safety. And so I would encourage people to look into opportunities such as that. There's also another initiative called the Youth Grantmakers Initiative in Baltimore, where, there's so much of the work that organizations do to support young people in the city. But typically it's sort of not young people. I mean, I somewhat young, but I'm not, I'm thinking young, like under 18 or under 21, to have like after school or summer programs for them. And again, we don't want it just to be folks like me who are over that age making decisions, but like, let's actually ask the young people, like, what's important to them? What do they want? And then let's actually bring them into the room to help make decisions about what summer programs are going to be funded that, them and their friends will go to. So I encourage people to look up those two examples. And then just, again, in your work, think about, again, not only how you're serving people, but really bringing them in to be leaders in the work that you're doing.
Wonderful. So we have a few more minutes if anyone has questions. One question I have is, what are your favorite networks? So let's say both for your profession and your work, but also just for people who might want to start learning about career paths and what's going on in the philanthropic world. And I'll say one of my favorites, emerging practitioners in philanthropy, but where do you encourage people to go both to understand the trends, the funding, and also find the career opportunities?
Yeah, I'm thinking of like that, plus also a couple of publications that I'll mention. One is the Chronicle of Philanthropy and also Inside Philanthropy. They both have daily or so newsletters that they will email out that will have, articles and trends and job opportunities. And it'll even share updates on like, this organization just hired this person, or like this person just joined. So it's very much like news and updates around all of these topics. There's also the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which has lots of helpful information. So I'd also encourage people to check that out. In terms of the network, I think, yes, emerging practitioners in philanthropy. There's a group called Change Philanthropy, which it really is a collaborative of all the different affinity groups. So you'll have, for example, the Association for Black Foundation Executives is a part of that. And then all the other affinity groups are a part of Change Philanthropy. So I would probably start there because however you identify, there's probably a group that's a part of Change Philanthropy that, has an affinity group for however you identify. So I think those are all great networks to be a part of.
And I always advise people, if you're exploring starting a career or mid-career, find the network hubs first. Mm-hmm. Because, whether it's like a peace and security funders group or whatever the funder group or the professional association, because they're often the ones convening the debates and trying to influence and understand impact in the field. And they often have professional conferences, online events, mm-hmm. and job boards, and then go to the individual ones as you learn about it.
Yeah, and I would also just add briefly, we talked about nonprofit boards. I also just want to make a plug also for just different committees. Like, even if you're not like on a board, like technically and legally, so many organizations just have like committees that people can be on. So like United Ways around the country will have different committees where you can volunteer and help them sort of allocate some of their grant funds. There's a lot of young professional groups like the Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy. There was a group very active in DC called Young Nonprofit Professionals Network. That had a lot of different committees. And again, these are both great opportunities because they will help you build relationships, but also when you're on those committees and helping do that work, it gives you really great skills and experiences that then you can build off of in the future.
Okay. So Ropa has a question I'm just going to address directly. They're based in South Africa, and just saying, what kind of employment opportunities are there for non-US citizens who are in the innovation space? So there are tons. And so a couple of things is go to PCN, look at our meta job board of all the innovation impact job boards in the world. And you'll find many that are focused on geographic regions or have remote opportunities. PCDN has a lot, Idealist, DevX, ReliefWeb. And then if you are looking to come to the US, Atlas Corps is a great opportunity. Their CEO is going to be on our podcast, John, I think in 3 weeks. But Atlas Corps is like reverse Peace Corps. And there's lots of other fellowship programs. Look at Fulbright, Open Society. I mean, it's not easy, but with remote work, or remote funding, there's some more opportunities than in the past. So we're starting to wind down. One question is just, what are you currently working on upskilling? Not that you have to be, but I can tell that you're always learning and engaging. So are you working on a new skill, a new language, or taking a course, or just reading a book or podcast?
Oh, I would love to learn a language. I would love to do all of that. It sounds fun. I think in terms of the podcast, I really listen to ones that are sort of like this style. I love just interview style podcasts, especially with entrepreneurs or different leaders about sort of what has been key for them. So there's one that's called How I Built This, which really focuses, I think, on more like traditional for-profit entrepreneurs, but there's some social entrepreneurs in there as well. And then there's also a program that's where Terry Gross is the host, and it's a lot of interviews with like newsmakers and different sort of like pop culture folks. But I just love those podcasts. This one included, and others where you really sort of get to deep dive with folks around what's been key and helpful for them in their career. So I love those sorts of things.
Okay. And then non-work wise, any shows you're watching or books you're reading that maybe have nothing to do with work, but just have, let's say, made your mind more alive or generated substantial thought beyond just, a single show or episode?
Yeah, I gotta say, Craig, one of my favorite types of show to watch are dating shows, and there are so many to watch. I think it's totally like not related to this work necessarily, but I just get so fascinated because of the like human connection component and just sort of like how we all make different decisions about like what's important to us, how we want our lives to be, how we connect or don't with other people. So I just love them because they're fascinating to me about like human connection and like intention and how we're planning for the future and like what matters to people. So there's so many, there's so many shows like that I tend to watch. And then I also just love like old, or I should say 90s sitcoms. I love just comedies. So I watch those quite often.
Okay. I mean, I tend not to watch dating shows, but I do. My wife watches some, but it would be interesting to see. I don't know, is there one on entrepreneurs or just like there would be something. There was a great series years ago. It wasn't a dating series called The Philanthropist. It was, it was very colonialistic. I think it was on NBC, and it was like this guy who went around the world trying to help address problems. And so it'd be fascinating to have like a dating show or some kind of matchmaking show around. I mean, there's so many sub-communities, but something on like impact entrepreneurs or people who are too busy trying to change the world or influence their communities.
Yeah.
And so maybe that can be something new we can pitch Netflix.
Yeah, I think that's your next podcast, right?
I mean, that is something like, dating and relationships in general. I mean, this is not for this podcast, but both my wife and I did PhDs, and I think PhDs can destroy relationships. It's I've never seen an academic study, but I do think there's something if both people in a relationship are both committed to social change, then there's a lot of understanding. But if one person is kind of like, super activist or social change maker and the other person is not, I'm not judging them, but that can create a lot of stress in a relationship.
Sure.
So it'd be interesting stuff. And then the last question is, if people want to engage with you, not that, please don't ask Darius for jobs, but if people just want to follow, engage you, is LinkedIn the best channel, Twitter, Mastodon, like, just for people to stay engaged on your work, where would you like people to follow you?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I would recommend LinkedIn. I post on there probably weekly or every other week, just with like things that I'm learning, seeing, or doing. I often even post about other leaders that I'm inspired by, like leaders that you may have never heard of, especially at the local level in Baltimore and other places. So definitely, take a look at what I have up on LinkedIn and feel free to reach out there. I also I'll try to find the link and maybe we could post it later, or I'll share it on LinkedIn. But I sometimes do what I call office hours, which is just like a 20-minute phone call where, like, if you're working on something or want to get into the social impact space or thinking about careers or, have a new venture where we could just like talk on the phone for 20 minutes and, I can sort of give you my take and advice and maybe offer some connections for you there. So I'll share that link later, or you can find it on LinkedIn, but that's definitely the best place to get in touch.
And last question, who else do you recommend that people interested in philanthropy and social impact might follow? For example, I'll just mention one person, Darren Walker, I think is one of the most exciting foundation leaders in the universe. And I worked years ago at an organization that had funding from Ford. I wasn't working on that project, but I think back then Ford was not at the fore. I mean, it's a big foundation, but it just wasn't doing the exciting things it's doing today. And and it came out, I forgot the name of his new book, but just came out with a book I encourage people to look at. But 2 or 3 other philanthropic leaders or social activists that you might say, hey, they're just doing such interesting work, maybe people might want to follow or engage with them.
Yeah, no, great question. I would recommend Kathy Garcia. She is someone that I have known for quite a bit, and we work together. She was recently with the Robin Hood Foundation, but she's now with an organization called Resilia, which is a tech platform that supports nonprofits. She has a lot of commentary on philanthropy, and especially from the perspective that I've been sharing about sort of how to shift and share power with impacted communities. She's on Twitter and on LinkedIn, so she's someone that I would recommend following, and that's Kathy Garcia. And then I'm thinking of actually another publication I didn't mention earlier, which is Nonprofit Quarterly. She shared a lot of Nonprofit Quarterly shares on this topic as well. So I recommend Kathy. In terms of others, I mentioned Brittany Young earlier. I mean, she's such an inspiring leader. So I would check out Brittany Young and B360. And there's so many other folks. If folks go on LinkedIn and take a look at my recent post from maybe last week or 2 weeks ago, I put a list of about 6 different leaders that I had the chance to spend time with a couple of weeks ago, who I was just really inspired by, who are leading work on the ground in Baltimore. So definitely check them out as well.
Okay, so thank you so much again, Darius, for sharing your wisdom and your energy and your insights, and for everyone for joining us from around the world. We had a lot of people in East Africa today. And again, you can watch this on LinkedIn, YouTube. This will be converted to a podcast episode and live within a month. Check out our 100 other podcast episodes, please. And again, May 12th, we will have Kathleen Anduke from the president of Mi Sangre Foundation, the Shoka Fellow. I think it's May 21st. I have to check the date. We will have Bijan, the CEO of Atlas Corps. And actually, I think also around that time, we'll have Arthur Woods, who's a serial entrepreneur from Matthias Imperative, and his new startup is called Plenty Search. So lots of interesting people coming up in May. And so Darius, have a wonderful day. I appreciate so much. I have very good friends in Baltimore, who are live 2 blocks from Johns Hopkins and very involved in art and social justice. So please keep doing the amazing work, both individually and through the foundation. Everyone, if you go to Baltimore, check out Johns Hopkins, the Art Museum, and so it's a lot of cool things in Crescent City, and just a very dynamic, exciting place. So, and actually, the one thing you were talking about, Baltimore Core, I don't think I know Fagan personally, but it's interesting, not to get into politics, but the founder or the former CEO of Baltimore Core, I think, is now the chief of staff for the governor, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And the governor is doing a lot of interesting stuff on service learning. Just It's exciting time in Maryland. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful morning. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.
I'm just hitting end.